Before Sunrise, filmed in 1994, premiered January 1995. When did Richard first come to you in Austin about co-writing the project? I know you've said it was 1993. What month was it? Do you remember?
Well, it was 1993 when we started writing the film. It was April, but he actually told me much earlier. It was, I cannot remember the exact month, but we were working on Dazed and Confused. It actually may have even started before Dazed and Confused, because when I met him, it was for the casting of his first film, Slacker. And I believe that was in 1988. And I didn't actually do a real acting performance in the casting. He just merely asked me about myself. And I told him I was working on this master's thesis about the diarist Anna East Nin. And he seemed very interested in that. And he asked me all about that. And then he cast me in Slacker. And every time I saw him, he said, I hope you give me that master's thesis to read. So I finished the master's thesis in 1991, let's see, I got the degree. I got the degree in 1991. And I'll bet you that he asked me in 1991 to read the master's thesis. And I think it took me a long time to actually give it to him, because I didn't really take him seriously. I just thought he was just being polite, and maybe I gave it to him in 1992 or something like that. And when I gave it to him on a Monday, and he called me on a Tuesday, asked to meet me the next day, which was Wednesday, and then he asked me to co-write with him. So that may have been in 1992 that he did that. I know it was a long time before we actually started writing.
Okay, so maybe even as far back as 92. In the 16 days you spent with Richard writing the script, was the name Before Sunrise thought of then, or was there a different working title at the time?
Yeah, that was not until a bit later. We did not have a solid working title. I'm trying to remember. That seemed to solidify quite a bit later, but I love it. But I know that we didn't have that while we were writing the script, so it was a bit later.
When Richard came to you about this idea, we know now that he had this meeting of two strangers and building a connection as the theme. You mentioned on the podcast Popcorn Talk that he kind of just came to you and said it's a boy meets girl film, and he didn't mention much else at the time about what the plot might be. And you based the story on your experience meeting someone from Norway when traveling through Europe on a train. Did Richard tell you about the experience he had talking all night with a girl he met in Philadelphia in 1989, walking around the city talking, and that he told her one day he would make a film about this? Or did he keep that to himself? Because the story seems like a beautiful mix of your experience and his experience kind of put together. Is that just like a coincidence?
Well, I did not hear at all about the girl in Philadelphia. There was no plot when we got together. And the Norwegian person I met was just kind of an example of the sort of person I would meet on my travels, because I did meet, when I was traveling in England and in Europe, on first Britrail and then on Eurail, I met a lot of different people. Sometimes men, or guys, and other times I'd meet some fun girl and we would go sightseeing together. And there were a lot of them. But when Rick and I sat down, there was no plot whatsoever. He did say he was thinking that maybe the couple could meet. There was no plot, but when we were talking about how they would meet, he said something about, what about a toy store? And I said, well, here, I noticed that you have these finite stories where people have an experience over the course of maybe 24 hours. And I said, I think a good way to encapsulate a relationship is meeting during travel, because it's, you know how it is when you're traveling. You may meet someone on a train or on a plane or in a hotel room, let's say hotel, and you may go sightseeing with them and then have to later you say goodbye or something like that. So I think that there's some mythology that is built up since the movie came out, honestly, about this whole thing about meeting the girl, because I didn't hear anything about that, or that he would tell her anything. That I heard absolutely nothing about that.
Once Vienna was chosen as the location, as they became kind of the source of funding, I believe, for the film, what then happened in regard to changing the script to make it fit the location, such as the cemetery of the nameless, the Prater, where they first kiss, and so on? Because now you have a film that's heavily about the location as well as the people. So when did those changes get made to the script?
Well, honestly, our script was just talking about all kinds of things. Some of the things that they talked about were pretty profound, about the past and death and, big cosmic realities. And we thought originally that the film would be shot in America. So when Rick got funding in Vienna, because I believe, he tried for funding just anywhere, but when it became clear that the funding would be in Vienna, it was very easy to transfer some of the conversations to the beautiful and romantic and classic locations. Say, for example, most cities have beautiful cemeteries, or so they have gorgeous areas. We originally thought the film was going to be shot in San Antonio, Texas, where they have a river walk and they have the Alamo, and they obviously have all kinds of things that could have worked for a conversation. So it just so happened that Vienna is a very romantic city. And I think that some of the conversations deepened a bit when, there was the opportunity to shoot in these gorgeous, gorgeous locations. So in other words, things may have deepened, but the basic conversation was there.
So when you last touched the script, it was kind of, or the stories, that was before Vienna was chosen, but most of the work was already done with you and Richard, and that was just kind of, you didn't have to go back and change much. It was just changes around the locations.
Well, Richard and I wrote the script, and then the actors came to Austin, Texas for a read through with us. This was a few days of hanging out with the actors and getting to know them and talking about the script. And during that time, we were talking about various scenes and what could be deepened and what could be changed. We were taking notes, and we watched some classic movies together and talked more deeply about other possibilities. And then when I know that when Rick went to Vienna, I was still in Austin, I was faxing scenes. For example, the scene in which they meet the psychic, the palm reader. I like science, and so I was reading about the origins of the universe and about how all of us our bodies are made of the materials that the elements that blew up in that first Big Bang. And I thought, well, gosh, I've got to get that in, but I want to do it in a poetic way. And the way to do that might be through, a palm reader or something. So I faxed that. And then I I'm just remembering some other bits, like, for example, the scene in which Julie tells, Celine tells Jesse that female spiders eat the male spider after they have sex with them. I faxed that because I had read that in a science article, and I thought that would be a funny thing to add. And so I was communicating via fax, which I think fax is sort of dead now, right? But that was the modern way in the late 80s and mid 90s to send information. It was really before emailing
Yeah.
and texting, right? So we thought that was really advanced back then,
You Are Stardust. That part came from your idea to bring that palm reader in.
Yes, it did, because I thought that I love reading about the origins of the universe. And I like, I just like science. I like the big macro stuff in science about like the origin of the species and the origin of the universe. And, I love these things, and I wanted to bring that in. And I thought that the way to do that was to do it poetically. How would this come up in a conversation? Well, I thought the best way to do that might be through some sort of wise lady, wise woman, psychic or palm reader. And so, because, at the time I was quite interested in I had a tarot deck and, these things that I was sort of exploring all that stuff back then. I had some books on astrology. And the thing that I thought was interesting about all that was that it's an ancient effort to understand where we came from. And I think that's kind of beautiful. Like all the symbols in the zodiac are kind of beautiful to me, even though, scientifically there may be no basis whatsoever. I think that ancient peoples had poetic things of describing, poetic ways of describing how we're here and what the meaning, the meaning of things that happen to us. And so I thought I wanted to bring that in some way. And so that's where that whole palm reader lady came in.
And now when you think about it, it's a perfect way to introduce something to a story without one of the main characters having to say it themselves. It can just be knowledge that gets dropped into them, and then they can react to it one way or the other, but you still get the idea into the story. So that's a clever idea. So you kind of touched on briefly that Julie and Ethan came to Austin, and then you all kind of got to know each other a little bit and talked about different ideas for the characters. Was Vienna at that point known as the location then, or was that still not known?
I believe that was known because that was in the spring of 1994, and they were going to be heading off in a couple. I believe that may have been April, of 1994. And so they filmed that in the summer of 1994. So I believe that after we knew that Vienna was going to be the location, Rick told me, and we found out that Ethan Hawke had an interest in the movie. Rick said that, well, I feel like in this case we should have a European woman. And I had watched a lot of casting interviews, and a lot of the women were Americans. And but he made the decision that I think we need to have a European because it will make a little bit more sense. I don't really want two Americans to meet in Europe on the train. I think it would make more sense to have one of the characters be European, and we've got Ethan, who's an American. Let's have a European woman. And one of the people who had auditioned was Julie. We had a number of Americans who I thought were really good audition. I mean, one of the people I remember is an actress named Lily Taylor, who was on a TV show in America called 6 Feet Under. She did a superb audition. And there were others who did a great job, but I think when it was nailed down, I don't know, I cannot remember when I saw those casting tapes, but when it was nailed down that it was a European, Rick decided on Julie because European, it makes sense that Ethan would run into her. They're roughly the same age. It's very likely that a couple like that would meet in a train car, just crossing paths in Europe, on Brit Rail.